The fire had died to embers 3 hours ago, yet Lachlan Doyle's underground shelter held steady at 67 degrees while the blizzard outside raged at 20 below zero. Across the frozen valley, 14 cabins sat abandoned, their occupants driven out by cold so brutal that burning every stick of firewood within 10 miles couldn't keep a man from freezing in his sleep. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories about forgotten frontier survival techniques, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just save your life in ways you never imagined. Lachlan Doyle stood at the entrance of his shelter and watched the wind turn snow into horizontal knives across the Wyoming basin. The storm had arrived 2 days earlier, dropping temperatures so low that spit froze before hitting the ground. He had ventured outside only to relieve himself and grab firewood from the modest stack near his door. Each trip took less than 3 minutes. Any longer, and exposed skin began to hurt. Inside, the temperature remained comfortable enough that he wore only a wool shirt and trousers. No heavy coat, no constant shivering, no desperate feeding of flames to maintain barely tolerable warmth. The small fire in his stone hearth burned with perhaps a dozen pieces of split wood, creating more light than heat. Yet the space stayed warm. Lachlan had lived through 3 winters in this underground chamber carved into a south-facing hillside. Each winter proved what the first winter had promised. While surface dwellers fought desperate battles against cold that killed as efficiently as any predator, he remained comfortable in a space that required almost no fuel to heat. The mathematics were simple. The earth surrounding his dwelling maintained a constant 48 to 50 degrees regardless of surface conditions. A small fire added 15 to 20 degrees, 65 to 70 degrees total. Comfortable, sustainable, survival without suffering. He moved back from the entrance and pulled the heavy wooden door closed. The seal wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Cold air entering through minor gaps sank immediately to the floor near the threshold. The main living space, elevated slightly and set back 12 feet into the hillside, remained protected. He had learned these details through observation during his first winter underground. Cold air behaved predictably. It settled low. Warm air rose. The chamber design exploited these natural patterns. Outside, the wind shrieked. Inside, silence. The earth absorbed sound as effectively as it moderated temperature. Lachlan settled onto his sleeping platform and opened the small journal he kept. He made an entry noting the date, February 9, 1844, the observed exterior temperature based on water freezing behavior, approximately 20 below zero, and the interior temperature, 67 degrees. He added wood, consumption for the day. 6 pieces. Total length perhaps 4 feet when laid end to end. He thought about the cabins scattered across the basin, 14 of them within a 10-mile radius. All abandoned now. Some had failed during the first brutal winter. Others held out through a second season before their occupants admitted defeat. The pattern was always the same. Families or solo hunters would arrive in autumn, build a log cabin using traditional methods, stock firewood, and settle in. Winter would come. The cold would intensify. Firewood consumption would skyrocket. Interiors would still freeze during the night. Water supplies would turn to ice. Desperation would set in. Eventually, survival instinct would override pride, and people would leave. Lachlan had tried to explain the solution. Some had listened. Most had dismissed him as eccentric or crazy. Living underground like an animal, they said, undignified, primitive. He didn't argue. He simply survived while they froze. Lachlan. Doyle met Fergus McBride in the autumn of 1841 in a trading post near Fort Laramie. Both men were headed into the mountains for winter hunting. Both were alone. Both preferred it that way, but both also understood that the remotest territories demanded partnerships for basic safety. They agreed to travel together and establish a shared camp. Fergus was older by 7 years, weathered and quiet. He had trapped beaver during the final years of the fur trade and transitioned to hunting when the beaver market collapsed. He knew the mountains, knew how to read weather, and knew when to speak and when to stay silent. Lachlan respected that. Too many frontiersmen talked constantly, filling silence with meaningless noise. Fergus understood that silence held information. They traveled northwest into what would later become southwestern Wyoming, following creek drainages into high basin country. The territory was remote enough to hold healthy populations of elk, deer, and buffalo, remote enough that few others competed for the same resources, remote enough that survival depended entirely on preparation and skill. By late October, they had selected a site. A small creek flowed through a basin surrounded by low hills. Timber was available. Game sign was abundant. Sight lines were good. The location had everything they needed, except one critical element they didn't yet know they lacked: protection from extreme cold. They built their cabin in 5 days. The structure was typical of frontier construction: logs cut from nearby pines, notched at corners, stacked to form walls roughly 10 feet by 12 feet. Gaps between logs were chinked with moss and mud. The roof was pole rafters covered with bark and a thin layer of sod. One door, one small window covered with scraped hide. A simple stone and mud fireplace in one corner. The work was competent. The cabin was functional. It would keep out wind and rain. That was the standard, and they met it. Neither man questioned whether the standard was adequate. Everyone built cabins this way. The method was proven accepted, traditional. They finished construction in early November and immediately began hunting. The work was productive. Elk were plentiful. They processed meat, smoking, and drying it for winter supplies. They tanned hides. They gathered firewood, stacking it against the cabin's exterior wall. By December, they had accumulated what seemed like adequate fuel for winter: 4 cords of split wood. Enough, they thought. The first serious cold arrived on December 18th. Temperature dropped overnight. By morning, their water bucket had frozen solid despite being inside the cabin near the fireplace. They built up the fire. The interior warmed slightly, perhaps reaching 40 degrees. They added more wood. 50 degrees. Comfortable enough while the fire blazed. But maintaining that temperature required constant fuel. By evening, they had burned through wood that should have lasted 3 days. Fergus looked at the dwindling woodpile and said nothing. Lachlan understood. They were in trouble. Winter had barely started. The cold deepened. By January, temperatures regularly dropped below zero at night. The cabin interior, despite a fire burning constantly, rarely exceeded 45 degrees. Often it fell below freezing during the darkest hours before dawn. Lachlan and Fergus slept in their clothes under multiple layers of hides and blankets. Even then they woke shivering. Firewood consumption became catastrophic. What they had assumed would last all winter was gone by mid-January. They spent every third day cutting and hauling more wood. The work was exhausting. Trees had to be felled, limbed, cut into sections, split, and carried back to camp. In extreme cold, the labor was punishing. Sweat froze on skin. Fingers went numb. Axes rang against frozen wood with jarring impact. The cabin itself was the problem, though they didn't fully understand it yet. The log. Construction, standard and accepted, was fundamentally flawed for extreme cold. Gaps between logs allowed wind infiltration. The chinking, dried and cracked by temperature cycling, no longer sealed effectively. Cold air poured in continuously. The roof, thin and poorly insulated, radiated heat upward. The floor, dirt in direct contact with frozen ground, conducted cold into the living space. Every surface of the cabin was exposed to sub-freezing air. Heat generated by the fire fought against heat loss through 6 surfaces simultaneously. The battle was unwinnable. They could burn wood fast enough to maintain marginal warmth, but the cost was unsustainable. The surrounding forest, which had seemed limitless in autumn, was being consumed at an alarming rate. Fergus began showing signs of strain. He was older, less resilient to cold stress. He developed a persistent cough. His appetite decreased. He spent more time sitting close to the fire, less time working outside. Lachlan noticed, but said nothing. What could be said? They were both trapped in the same impossible situation. By late January, they had burned through 6 cords of wood. They were cutting into standing dead timber farther from camp, hauling logs through snow in temperatures that made every breath painful. The effort required to stay warm was consuming more energy than they could replace through food. Both men were losing weight. Other signs of crisis appeared. Their water supply froze despite being stored inside. They melted snow for drinking water, a process that consumed more firewood. Their smoked meat, hung inside the cabin, froze solid and had to be thawed near the fire before eating. The hide window covering, brittle from cold, tore and had to be replaced. Fergus stopped talking entirely. He moved slowly, conserving energy. He slept longer hours. Lachlan understood what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it. The cold was winning. The cabin, their shelter, their protection, was barely functional. They were surviving, but only through constant, exhausting effort that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. On February 4, 1842, the temperature dropped to 25 below zero. The fire burned all night. It wasn't enough. Lachlan woke before dawn on February 5th. The fire had died to coals. The interior temperature had dropped catastrophically during the night. His breath was visible in the thick clouds. Ice crystals covered the inside walls. He moved immediately to rebuild the fire, his hands clumsy with cold. Fergus didn't move. Lachlan called his name. No response. He crossed the cabin and touched Fergus's shoulder. The body was rigid. Cold had penetrated the blankets and hides. Fergus had simply stopped generating enough heat to survive. The cold had taken him quietly during the night, while Lachlan slept 3 feet away. Lachlan stood motionless for a long time. The fire caught and began pushing back the darkness. Light filled the cabin, revealing the frost patterns on the walls, the frozen water bucket, the inadequate shelter that had killed his partner through simple, patient cold. He had seen death before. Frontier life delivered it regularly through accident, violence, disease, and exposure. But this death felt different, preventable. Fergus hadn't been attacked, he hadn't fallen or been injured. He had frozen to death inside a structure specifically built to prevent freezing. The cabin had failed its only essential function. Lachlan wrapped Fergus's body in blankets and carried it outside. The ground was frozen iron hard. Digging a grave was impossible. He placed the body in a snowbank away from the cabin and covered it with additional snow. A temporary measure. Proper burial would have to wait for thaw. He returned to the cabin and sat by the fire. The structure felt hostile now. Every gap between logs seemed to mock him. Every draft was an indictment. He had built this cabin with Fergus. They had followed, accepted. Methods. They had done everything correctly, according to frontier tradition. And those traditions had killed his partner. The cold that morning was absolute, perhaps 30 below zero. The fire, even built up to maximum size, barely warmed the space. Lachlan could feel heat radiating from the flames, but 2 feet away the air was still frigid. The warmth didn't distribute. It didn't fill the cabin. It simply rose and escaped through the poorly insulated roof. He thought about the wood they had burned. Thousands of pounds of timber converted to heat that disappeared almost immediately. He thought about the effort required, the constant cutting, hauling, splitting, feeding, the exhaustion. And for what? To maintain temperatures barely above freezing in a space that should have protected them. Something shifted in Lachlan's thinking that morning. The accepted method was wrong. The traditional cabin design was fundamentally inadequate. Everyone built this way because everyone had always built this way. But tradition based on inadequate results wasn't wisdom. It was collective failure. When the ground thawed enough in late March, Lachlan buried Fergus on a hillside overlooking the creek. He marked the grave with stones and spent that evening in the cabin, unable to sleep. The cabin felt like a tomb, a failed experiment, a structure built on assumptions that couldn't withstand reality. He decided something that night. He would not spend another winter in a surface cabin. He would find a better way or die trying. Lachlan spent 3 days digging Fergus's grave. The ground had thawed only in the top 6 inches. Below that, soil remained frozen from winter's deep penetration. He used a pickaxe to break through the frost layer, then a shovel to remove loosened earth. The work was brutal. Each swing of the pickaxe sent jarring impacts through his arms and shoulders. By the second day, he had reached a depth of 3 feet. The soil at this level was different, still cold, but no longer frozen solid. It had a dampness to it, a softness that the surface soil lacked. He could work it with the shovel alone, no pickaxe needed. The temperature difference was noticeable. His hands, which had gone numb, working the frozen surface layers, stayed functional at depth. He paused during the 3rd day and knelt in the grave. The hole was now 4 feet deep, adequate for burial. But something about the soil at this depth captured his attention. He pressed his bare hand against the bottom of the grave. The earth was cool, but not frozen, perhaps 45 degrees, maybe 50. Hard to judge precisely, but dramatically warmer than the surface. The surface soil, exposed to air temperatures still hovering near freezing during March nights, was cold and hard. 4 feet down, insulated by the layers above, the earth maintained a stable temperature regardless of what happened at the surface. The difference was remarkable. The transition from frozen surface to soft subsurface occurred within a vertical distance of less than 3 feet. Lachlan had grown up on stories from his grandfather about Scotland, about families living in turf houses built into hillsides, structures covered with sod and earth, warm in winter, cool in summer. He had dismissed those stories as exaggerations or primitive necessity from a time before proper construction methods. But standing in that grave, feeling the temperature differential between surface and subsurface earth, the stories took on new meaning. Heat moved through materials at different rates. Wood was a poor conductor. Earth was even worse. That's why root cellars stayed cool in summer. The earth insulated the interior from warm surface temperatures. The same principle would work in reverse. Earth could insulate from cold surface temperatures, maintaining interior warmth. A cabin fought the cold. Thin wooden walls tried to contain heat while exposed to freezing air on all sides. The battle was constant, and the walls were losing. But Earth didn't fight. It simply existed at its own stable temperature, unaffected by surface extremes. If a space could be created within the Earth rather than on top of it, that space would automatically maintain Earth temperature. No fighting required. Lachlan finished the grave and buried Fergus. He piled stones over the site to prevent scavengers from digging. He stood there for a time, looking at the finished work. His partner was gone. The cabin had failed, but something else had emerged from the digging. An idea, a possibility, a different approach to shelter that rejected everything traditional construction assumed. He walked back to the cabin that evening with his mind working through calculations. Depth, temperature, excavation methods, structural requirements. The idea was forming, becoming concrete, transforming from abstract possibility into specific plan. Lachlan stopped hunting. The pelts and meat he had accumulated would sustain him through spring. His focus shifted entirely to understanding why cabins failed and whether an alternative existed. He became methodical, almost scientific in his investigation. He needed data. He needed observations. He needed to understand the physics of heat and cold, even if he didn't have formal language for those concepts. He visited Aidan Kilpatrick first. Kilpatrick's cabin was 8 miles south, built the previous year. Lachlan found it abandoned. The roof had collapsed under snow weight in January. The logs showed signs of someone trying to repair the damage, then giving up. Ice still clung to the interior walls. The fireplace was cold, Kilpatrick himself had retreated to a trading post 40 miles east. Lachlan tracked him down and asked questions. How much wood had he burned? 3 cords by December. How cold did the interior get? Below freezing most nights. Why did the roof fail? Weight of ice build up from moisture escaping through gaps and freezing on contact with cold roof materials. Declan. Murtaugh's cabin was still occupied, but barely. Murtaugh had survived winter, but looked haggard. His wood supply was nearly exhausted. He had burned through 5 cords, more than expected, because the cabin simply wouldn't hold heat. He was planning to leave before next winter. The struggle wasn't sustainable. Ewan Drummond had built a larger cabin with his brother. Both had abandoned it in January after one brother developed frostbite despite being inside near the pier. The cabin had better chinking than most, tighter log fitting, but it still failed. Cold infiltrated through the floor, through the roof, through microscopic gaps that expanded under temperature cycling. Lachlan visited 9 cabins total over a 3-week period. The pattern was identical. Every structure bled heat continuously. Every occupant fought a losing battle against cold. The only variable was how long people could sustain the fight before exhaustion, injury, or death forced retreat. He started paying attention to natural structures, animal dens, bear caves, badger burrows. These creatures survived winter without fire, without wood supplies, without constant effort. They simply occupied spaces protected from wind and insulated by earth. Their body heat alone, minimal as it was, kept them alive through months of hibernation. A bear den was essentially a cave or hollow, often dug into a hillside covered with earth and vegetation. Interior temperature stayed above freezing even when exterior air reached far below zero. The earth provided insulation. The small opening minimized heat loss. The animal's body generated just enough warmth to maintain survivable conditions. Could the same principle work for humans? A space excavated into earth, insulated by surrounding soil, heated by a small fire instead of body heat alone. The mathematics seemed favorable. Earth temperature at depth was 45 to 50 degrees. Add 20 degrees from a modest fire. Result, 65 to 70 degrees. Comfortable, sustainable. People began talking. Lachlan Doyle had gone strange, lost his partner, and lost his mind, asking odd questions about dirt temperature and animal burrows, planning to dig a hole and live in it like a beast. The mockery was open and widespread. Callum Thorne told him directly, abandoning proper construction for hole dwelling was admitting defeat, surrendering dignity, choosing animal existence over human civilization. Lachlan didn't argue. He simply continued his research. Spring turned to summer. Lachlan remained in the basin, living in the cabin he now despised, planning his next shelter with obsessive detail. He filled pages of his journal with sketches and calculations. Chamber dimensions, entrance orientation, roof thickness, ventilation requirements. Every aspect needed consideration. The fundamental concept was clear. Excavate horizontally into a hillside rather than building vertically on the surface. Create a chamber completely surrounded by earth, except for a single entrance. Use the Earth's stable subsurface temperature as baseline insulation. Heat the space minimally to achieve comfort, but execution required solving specific problems. First, structural stability. Soil had to support its own weight above the chamber without collapsing. Sand or loose soil wouldn't work. Clay-rich soil with natural cohesion was necessary. Second, drainage. Water had to flow away from the entrance, not into the chamber. Site selection was critical. Third, ventilation. A sealed underground space would suffocate occupants. Airflow had to be managed carefully. Lachlan spent weeks evaluating potential sites. He needed a hillside with proper drainage, south-facing for sun exposure at the entrance, composed of stable soil, and located near water and timber. He tested soil by digging test holes. Too sandy, and the hole collapsed. Too rocky and excavation would be impossible. The right soil had clay content for stability, but enough organic material to be workable. He found the site in late June, a low hill rising 30 feet above the basin floor, south-facing slope, creek 200 yards distant. Soil composition was nearly perfect, clay-loam mix that held its shape when excavated but wasn't rock-hard. Drainage flowed naturally away from where he planned the entrance. He marked the location and began gathering information on excavation techniques. He had no formal training in mining or tunneling. His knowledge came from observation and logic. The chamber needed to be large enough for living, but small enough that the roof span didn't exceed soil's natural load-bearing capacity. He settled on dimensions: 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the hillside, 7 feet high. The mathematical reasoning was simple. A 10-foot span could be supported by compacted clay loam without additional structure if the roof thickness was adequate. 12 feet of depth would place the back wall far enough into the hillside for complete earth insulation. 7 feet of height allowed him to stand comfortably while keeping the roof span manageable. People continued to mock. Word had spread that Doyle was actually going through with his burrow plan. Some thought it was temporary insanity born from grief. Others thought he was simply peculiar. A few expressed genuine concern that he was making a fatal mistake, that he would suffocate underground or be buried alive when the roof collapsed. Callum Thorne visited in July and tried one last time to talk sense into him. "Build a proper cabin," Thorne said. "Improve the design, use better chinking, make the walls thicker." Lachlan listened politely and explained the mathematics. Surface structures exposed to cold air on all sides would always lose heat faster than could be replaced efficiently. Underground structures surrounded by earth maintaining stable temperature would require minimal heating. Thorne left shaking his head, convinced Lachlan had abandoned reason entirely. By August, Lachlan was ready. He had tools: shovel, pickaxe, iron bar for breaking rocks, buckets for removing soil. He had a plan: excavate chamber first, then construct entrance, finally install door and ventilation. He started digging on August 15, 1842. Lachlan spent the final weeks of summer preparing the exact location where his underground chamber would be carved. The hillside he had selected in late June now underwent careful evaluation for specific entry point placement. Every detail mattered: water drainage, sun angle, prevailing wind direction, distance to resources. This wasn't merely choosing a spot. It was engineering survival into landscape. He walked the slope repeatedly, observing how water moved during summer rainstorms. Runoff flowed naturally down the hill in channels carved by years of weather. He marked these channels with stakes. His entrance needed to be positioned where water would flow past, not into, the opening. A location between two natural drainage paths was ideal. Sun angle required calculation. In winter, the sun stayed low on the southern horizon. A south-facing entrance would receive maximum sunlight during short winter days. Sunlight meant passive warming of the entrance area. It meant reduced ice buildup on the door. It meant psychological benefit during months of darkness and cold. He used a stick planted vertically to track shadows across several days, confirming the optimal entrance orientation. The soil itself needed testing beyond his initial assessment. He dug multiple test holes at different elevations on the slope. The holes revealed soil layering. The top 6 inches were organic topsoil, loose and rich. Below that, 18 inches of clay loam transition zone. Deeper still, dense clay mixed with small stones. This deep clay layer was what he needed for the chamber roof. It would support weight without collapsing. Prevailing winds came from the northwest during winter. Lachlan confirmed this by observing snowdrift patterns and wind-shaped vegetation. He positioned his planned entrance to face southeast, angled slightly away from direct wind exposure. This would reduce cold air being forced into the chamber during storms. Distance to resources mattered for daily survival. The creek was 200 yards downhill. Manageable for water hauling, timber for firewood stood 300 yards to the west. Adequate. Too close, and he would quickly exhaust local wood supplies. Too far, and hauling would consume excessive energy. He established the exact entry point with ceremony, driving a stake into the ground and building a small cairn of stones around it. This marker represented commitment. Everything that followed would radiate from this single point. The underground chamber would extend horizontally into the hill from here. The entrance structure would frame this opening. His survival depended on choosing correctly. The elevation was critical for another reason he had learned from cabins. Failures. Cold air sinks. Valleys and low areas become cold pockets where frigid air accumulates. His chamber entrance sat 40 feet above the basin floor. Cold air would drain away downhill. The location would be several degrees warmer than low-lying areas simply due to elevation and air drainage patterns. He tested the final detail, digging ease. He excavated a small pilot hole at the marked entrance point, going down 3 feet, then angling horizontally into the hillside. The soil was dense but workable. No large rocks blocked the path. No underground water seepage appeared. The test hole confirmed feasibility. By mid-August, all assessments were complete. The site was perfect. Lachlan gathered his tools, laid them beside the entrance marker, and prepared for weeks of relentless excavation. The underground chamber existed now only as concept and mathematics. Soon, it would be physical reality carved from earth. Lachlan began digging on August 16, 1842. He started by expanding the test hole into a proper entrance trench. The work was immediately brutal. Every shovel of soil had to be lifted and carried out. Every bucket of earth removed represented progress measured in inches. The labor required was exponential compared to building a surface cabin. The first 3 days were spent creating the entrance cut. He dug a vertical trench 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide into the hillside face. This trench would become the threshold between exterior and interior. The vertical walls required careful shaping to prevent collapse. He angled them slightly, creating a subtle batter that improved stability. Once the entrance trench reached proper depth, he began horizontal excavation into the hillside. This was the chamber itself. He worked from the entrance backward, removing soil and carrying it out in buckets. The technique was straightforward but exhausting. Dig, load bucket, carry bucket out, dump soil, return, repeat. Hundreds of times daily. The chamber floor was established at the bottom of the entrance trench. He kept it level using a simple water-level device, a length of hollow reed filled with water. Water seeks its own level. By holding the reed horizontally and observing water position at each end, he could ensure the floor stayed flat as he worked deeper into the hillside. Width was controlled by measuring with a rope marked at 10-foot length. He stretched the rope across the chamber width repeatedly as he dug, maintaining consistent dimensions. The walls curved slightly, following natural soil strength lines rather than rigid straight edges. This actually improved stability. Height was the most challenging dimension to control. He needed 7 feet of clearance, but also needed adequate roof thickness. Too thin, and the roof would collapse under the weight of soil above. Too thick, and he would be digging unnecessarily deep into the hillside. He settled on maintaining 18 inches of compacted clay above the chamber ceiling. This meant excavating to a total depth of approximately 9 feet below the surface directly above the chamber center. By the end of the first week, he had penetrated 6 feet into the hillside. The chamber was taking shape but remained crude. The walls were rough. The ceiling was uneven. Soil continually crumbled from surfaces, requiring constant cleaning and reshaping. Structural concerns appeared. At 8 feet of depth, a section of ceiling sagged slightly. Lachlan immediately stopped excavating and installed support. He cut a pine log 8 inches in diameter and wedged it vertically from floor to ceiling at the weak point. The support transferred roof weight to the floor, preventing collapse. He added 2 more support posts as he continued deeper, creating a safety margin. The final chamber depth was achieved on September 2nd, 12 feet from entrance to back wall. The space was dark, cool, and smelled of raw earth. Lachlan stood inside and felt the temperature difference immediately. Outside, late summer heat pushed temperatures into the 80s. Inside the chamber, the air was cool and stable, perhaps 55 degrees. The earth insulation was already working without any additional heating. Excavation had taken 17 days of continuous labor. Approximately 40 tons of soil removed by hand, 1 bucket at a time. With the chamber excavated, Lachlan turned his attention to the entrance structure. The vertical trench where chamber met exterior needed reinforcement. Soil walls, even carefully shaped, would erode under weather exposure. Stone construction was necessary to create a permanent stable portal. He spent 4 days gathering fieldstone from the creek bed 200 yards away. The stones needed specific characteristics: flat surfaces for stacking, weight sufficient for stability, size manageable for one man to carry. He selected each stone individually, rejecting those that were too round, too small, or fractured. He hauled them uphill in a canvas sling, making dozens of trips. The stone wall would serve 3 functions. First, retaining wall to hold back the excavated earth on either side of the entrance. Second, structural frame for mounting the door. Third, weather barrier to protect the chamber from rain and snow infiltration. The design had to address all 3 requirements simultaneously. Lachlan began at the bottom of the entrance trench, laying foundation stones directly on undisturbed soil. He selected the largest, flattest stones for this base course. Each stone was positioned carefully, leveled using his water reed device, then locked in place with smaller stones wedging gaps. No mortar was used. The stones relied on weight and friction for stability. The second course overlapped the first, creating interlocking structure. He followed traditional dry stone wall technique, learned from his grandfather's descriptions of Scottish construction. Each stone bridged the joint between 2 stones below. Gaps were minimized, weight distributed across multiple contact points. The wall grew slowly, rising 1 course per day. By the 5th course, the wall had reached 3 feet high. At this height, Lachlan began shaping the doorway opening. He selected 2 particularly large flat stones as threshold pieces, positioning them to create a level sill. The doorway would be 4 feet wide, adequate for passing through while carrying firewood or supplies, but narrow enough that a door could be secured effectively. The sides of the doorway required vertical stones set on edge to create jambs. These stones had to be thick enough to support door hinges and withstand stress from door operation. Lachlan chose stones 6 inches thick and set them firmly into the wall structure, surrounding them with smaller stones locked tightly into place. The wall continued upward past the doorway opening until it reached 6 feet total height. At this point, the stone structure transitioned from retaining wall to facade. The top course was capped with flat stones, creating a slight outward slope. This cap directed water away from the entrance, preventing moisture from seeping down through the stonework into the chamber. The entire entrance construction took 12 days. When finished, the stone portal stood as a robust frame, defining the transition from exterior hillside to interior chamber. The craftsmanship was visible in the tight-fitting and stable structure. No stone shifted when pushed, no gaps allowed wind penetration. The entrance would last decades without maintenance, anchoring the hidden chamber behind it to the visible world. Lachlan moved into the raw chamber in mid-September while continuing interior work. The space was functional but crude. Walls showed tool marks and irregular surfaces. The floor was uneven, packed earth. The ceiling remained rough with support posts interrupting the space. He spent the next 3 weeks transforming the excavated hole into livable quarters. The walls required smoothing. He used a flat wooden paddle to compress and shape the clay loam surfaces. The paddle, applied with firm pressure, created a harder surface less prone to crumbling. He worked systematically from floor to ceiling, section by section. The compressed walls developed a slightly polished appearance where the paddle burnished the clay. The floor needed leveling and hardening. He removed loose soil and compacted the base layer by wetting it and tamping with a heavy log. Once level, he added a 2-inch layer of sand hauled from the creek. Over the sand, he laid flat stones in the high traffic areas near the entrance and fireplace. The stone floor would resist wear and prevent mud formation during wet seasons. The sleeping platform was built against the back wall. He excavated a shallow alcove 18 inches deep into the wall, creating a recessed space. Into this recess, he constructed a simple frame using pine logs 8 inches in diameter. The frame was 5 feet wide and 7 feet long, elevated 2 feet above the main floor. This elevation served 2 purposes: storage space beneath and separation from cold air that would settle at floor level. Storage shelves were carved directly into the walls. Lachlan excavated horizontal niches at shoulder height along both side walls. Each niche was 2 feet deep, 1 foot high, and 3 feet long. The clay soil was stable enough that these alcoves held their shape without reinforcement. He smoothed the interior surfaces and created slight lips at the front edges to prevent items from sliding out. The fireplace location required careful consideration. He chose the left front corner near the entrance. This position allowed smoke to exit without filling the entire chamber. Heat would radiate into the main living space while the entrance area could serve as a cold air sink. He excavated a firebox 2 feet wide, 18 inches deep, and 2 feet high directly into the wall. The chimney was Lachlan's most challenging construction element. He needed to vent smoke through 6 feet of earth to the surface without allowing rain to pour down the flue. He used the technique of stacking small stones vertically to create a narrow passage. The chimney angled slightly from the firebox, rising at a steep diagonal through the roof mass. He waterproofed the chimney top by creating a stone cap elevated on 4 cornerstones. Rain would hit the cap and drain away, while smoke could exit through the gaps. He tested the draft by building a small fire. Smoke rose steadily up the flue and exited cleanly. The draw was excellent due to temperature differential between interior and exterior air. The ceiling supports remained visible, but Lachlan shaped them into functional elements. He notched the posts to create hooks for hanging tools and supplies. The center post became an anchor point for a simple rope and pulley system he could use to hang meat for smoking near the fireplace. By early October, the interior was complete. The chamber had transformed from raw excavation into refined living space. The chamber roof was already established by the soil above, but Lachlan needed to ensure long-term stability and weatherproofing. The 18 inches of clay above the ceiling provided structural support, but the surface required treatment to prevent erosion and water infiltration. He spent late October working exclusively on roof enhancement. First, he addressed the ceiling interior. The rough clay surface would shed particles continuously. He mixed a slurry of clay and water to plaster consistency and applied it to the entire ceiling using a flat wooden trowel. The plaster filled small cracks and created a smoother surface. As it dried, it hardened into a shell that bonded with the underlying clay. On the exterior surface directly above the chamber, Lachlan began layering waterproofing materials. He harvested birch bark from trees near the creek. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible. He laid sheets of bark in overlapping layers across the entire roof area, extending 3 feet beyond the chamber perimeter on all sides. Each sheet overlapped the one below, creating a shingled effect. The bark layer alone wasn't sufficient for long-term protection. Lachlan covered the bark with a 6-inch layer of clay mixed with grass. He had observed that pure clay cracked when it dried. Adding chopped grass created reinforcement. The grass fibers prevented crack formation by distributing stress throughout the clay matrix. He mixed the clay and grass thoroughly, then spread it evenly over the bark layer. Over the clay-grass mixture, he added 12 inches of topsoil excavated from the chamber. This soil contained organic material and seeds. The organic content would decompose and create structure. The seeds would germinate and grow roots. Living plant roots were the ultimate waterproofing because they created a self-maintaining system. He scattered additional grass seed across the soil layer and watered it thoroughly. Within 2 weeks, grass sprouted across the entire roof surface. The roots grew downward, binding the soil. The grass blades grew upward, creating a living mat that would shed rain and snow while preventing erosion. The final roof thickness measured approximately 20 inches from ceiling interior to grass surface. The layered system provided multiple functions: structural support from compacted clay, waterproofing from birch bark, crack resistance from grass-reinforced clay, erosion control from topsoil, and living stabilization from rooted grass. Lachlan constructed one final roof element, the chimney extension. The stone chimney emerging from the roof needed protection from the elements while maintaining draft. He built a small stone housing around the chimney top, creating a miniature shelter that kept rain from pouring directly down the flue while allowing smoke to exit freely. By early November, the roof was complete and tested. Several rainstorms had passed with no water infiltration into the chamber. The grass had established fully, creating a seamless green surface that blended with the surrounding hillside. From a distance of 50 yards, the underground chamber was invisible. Only someone who knew exactly where to look could identify the stone entrance portal nestled into the slope. The structure was ready for winter. Lachlan moved his supplies into the chamber on November 3, 1842. He carried in his sleeping furs, cooking equipment, tools, remaining food stores, and firewood. Everything had to pass through the narrow entrance, requiring multiple trips. Once inside, he organized the space with careful attention to efficiency. Firewood was stacked along the right wall near the fireplace. He estimated he had 1 cord of split wood gathered throughout October. Based on his calculations, this should last the entire winter with minimal additional gathering. The estimate seemed impossibly optimistic compared to the 3 to 6 cords required for cabin heating, but he trusted the mathematics. Food supplies went onto the carved wall shelves: dried meat, parched corn, beans, salt, coffee. He had enough for 4 months if he hunted occasionally to supplement. The chamber's cool, stable temperature would preserve food far better than a cabin where temperature cycling encouraged spoilage. His rifle, powder horn, and shot bag hung on wall pegs near the sleeping platform. Tools were organized on additional pegs. Knife, hatchet, awl, whetstone, everything had a designated location. In the confined space, organization was essential to prevent chaos. The first night in the completed chamber was revelatory. Outside, November cold had arrived. Temperature dropped into the 20s. Inside, without any fire, the chamber maintained 52 degrees. Lachlan could feel the stable coolness, noticeably warmer than exterior air, but not yet comfortable for extended occupation. He built a fire, small, perhaps 6 pieces of split wood, total volume less than 1 cubic foot. The fire burned in the stone firebox, smoke drawing perfectly up the chimney. Within an hour, the chamber temperature rose to 65 degrees, comfortable enough to remove his heavy coat, warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves. He maintained the fire for 3 hours, adding wood occasionally to keep steady flames. Then he let it die to coals and eventually go out completely. Outside temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. He waited to see what would happen to interior temperature without active heating. The chamber cooled slowly, very slowly. After 2 hours with no fire, interior temperature had dropped only to 60 degrees. The thermal mass of surrounding Earth was releasing stored heat, moderating the temperature decline. After 4 hours, it stabilized at 56 degrees. Cold enough to require warm clothes, but far above exterior temperature and far above what an unheated cabin would maintain. Lachlan slept comfortably under 2 wool blankets. He woke once during the night and noted the chamber felt cool but not cold. Certainly not the bone-deep chill he had experienced in the cabin. His breath was visible but not freezing into ice crystals. Water in a bucket near his sleeping platform was liquid, not frozen. Morning brought clear understanding of what he had created. The chamber maintained livable temperature without fire through the coldest part of night. A small fire during morning and evening would easily keep interior conditions comfortable throughout winter. The firewood consumption would be minimal. The effort required would be sustainable. He had built a shelter that worked with natural thermal principles rather than fighting against them. The earth surrounding the chamber was the insulation. The stable subsurface temperature was the baseline warmth. November transitioned into December. Temperature dropped steadily. The basin experienced its first major snowfall on December 8th. 8 inches accumulated overnight. Lachlan woke to profound silence inside the chamber. Snow acted as additional insulation on the roof, muffling exterior sound completely. The underground space felt isolated from the storm, protected, separate from the chaos above. He emerged through the entrance to assess conditions. The landscape was transformed. White covered everything. Temperature was perhaps 5 degrees. Wind drove snow horizontally across the basin. Exposed skin hurt within seconds. He gathered an armload of firewood from his exterior stack, returned inside, and closed the door. The contrast was remarkable. Outside, brutal cold, cutting wind, dangerous exposure. Inside, calm, quiet, stable temperature of 54 degrees without any fire yet burning. He built up the morning fire using 8 pieces of wood. Within 30 minutes, interior temperature reached 68 degrees, comfortable warmth achieved with fuel. Consumption that seemed almost negligible. He monitored his wood usage carefully. Each morning he burned approximately 6 to 8 pieces to bring temperature from overnight lows of 52 to 54 degrees up to comfortable 65 to 70 degrees. Each evening, another 6 to 8 pieces maintained warmth through dinner and evening hours. Total daily consumption, 12 to 16 pieces averaging 3 inches in diameter and 18 inches long. The mathematics were striking. 16 pieces daily meant he was burning approximately 1/10 of a cord per week. His 1-cord supply would last 10 weeks minimum, possibly longer, as he refined his burning technique. A cabin required 3 to 6 cords for the same period. The efficiency improvement was between 30-fold and 60-fold. Across the basin, other settlers were experiencing different realities. Lachlan occasionally spotted smoke from distant cabins, thick columns indicating large fires burning constantly. He knew what that smoke represented: desperate attempts to maintain marginal warmth, rapid depletion of wood supplies, exhausting daily labor gathering more fuel. Declan Murtaugh's cabin was visible from a rise near Lachlan's entrance. The smoke from Murtaugh's chimney was continuous and heavy. Murtaugh was burning wood at unsustainable rates, fighting the losing battle Lachlan had fought the previous winter. At that consumption rate, Murtaugh would exhaust accessible timber before February. Ewan Drummond had already left. His cabin sat abandoned, windows dark, no smoke. Drummond had lasted until late November before admitting defeat and retreating to lower elevations. The cabin would likely be torn apart by weather and scavengers before spring. The temperature continued dropping. By late December, nighttime lows reached 15 below zero. Lachlan's chamber remained stable. Interior temperature, without fire, stayed at 50 to 52 degrees. With minimal morning and evening fires, he maintained 65 to 70 degrees throughout the day. The earth insulation performed exactly as predicted. He ventured outside only for necessities: firewood gathering, water from the creek, occasional hunting. Each trip reinforced how hostile the surface environment had become. The cold was dangerous. Extended exposure would kill. Yet his underground shelter remained comfortable with effort so minimal it felt almost effortless compared to cabin life. Snow accumulated on the roof, adding insulation. The grass-covered surface became invisible under white blanket. The chamber entrance was the only visible sign of human presence, a dark portal in white hillside. January 1843 brought cold that exceeded anything Lachlan had experienced. Temperature dropped to 25 below zero and stayed there for days. The wind was relentless, driving chill factors far lower. This was the crisis that would test every shelter in the basin. This was the cold that killed. Lachlan's chamber responded to the extreme cold with remarkable stability. Interior temperature, without fire, dropped to 48 degrees, the lowest he had recorded. But 48 degrees was survivable. Uncomfortable for extended periods without warm clothing, but not life-threatening. He increased his fire frequency slightly, maintaining small fires 3 times daily instead of 2. This brought interior temperature back to 65 to 70 degrees. His firewood consumption increased, but remained manageable. Perhaps 20 pieces daily during the coldest week, still far below what cabins required. He was burning through his wood supply faster than planned, but the supply would still outlast winter comfortably. The crisis for surface dwellers was catastrophic. Smoke from Declan Murtaugh's cabin became intermittent, then stopped entirely on January 14th. Lachlan investigated 2 days later and found the cabin abandoned. Murtaugh had fled. The interior was frozen solid. Water bucket was ice. Remaining food supplies were frozen and partially eaten by scavengers who had broken through the poorly secured door. Aidan Kilpatrick's rebuilt cabin failed again. The roof, repaired after the previous collapse, gave way under accumulated ice and snow weight. The structure was uninhabitable. Kilpatrick departed for Fort Laramie, a journey of 60 miles in brutal cold. Lachlan later heard he had lost 3 toes to frostbite during the trek. Callum Thorne's cabin was still occupied, but Thorne was burning furniture to supplement exhausted firewood supplies. When Lachlan visited in late January, Thorne looked gaunt and desperate. The cabin interior was perhaps 35 degrees despite a fire consuming chair legs and table planks. Thorne admitted he was considering abandoning the site, but feared the journey out would kill him. Across the basin, the pattern repeated. Cabins were failing, occupants were fleeing, suffering, or dying. The 14 structures that had seemed adequate in autumn were proving fatally inadequate in the deep winter crisis. The cold was too extreme, the structures too flawed, the fuel requirements too high. By early February, every cabin within 10 miles was abandoned except Thorne's, and Thorne was barely surviving. 14 families or solo hunters had built homes following traditional methods. 14 had failed. The failure wasn't due to poor craftsmanship or laziness. The structures were built competently. The failure was inherent in the design approach itself. Lachlan emerged from his chamber each morning into a landscape of failure, abandoned cabins, desperate smoke from the single remaining occupied structure, frozen evidence of retreat and defeat scattered across the snow. His underground shelter, mocked and dismissed months earlier, was the only dwelling functioning as intended. The contrast validated everything: his obsessive planning, his unconventional thinking, his willingness to be mocked. The mathematics had been correct. The physics had been sound. Going underground wasn't primitive. It was the only rational response to extreme cold. Spring arrived in late March. Snow melted. Temperature moderated. The basin transformed from frozen white to muddy brown. Lachlan emerged from winter having burned approximately 1.5 cords of wood total. He had maintained comfortable living conditions throughout the coldest months while using less fuel than most cabins consumed in a single January week. The abandoned cabins were now visible in full detail. Roofs collapsed, doors torn from hinges by wind, or desperate animals seeking shelter. Interiors filled with drifted snow. The structures hadn't simply been vacated, they had been destroyed by the winter they were supposed to protect against. Callum Thorne survived, but barely. He appeared at Lachlan's entrance in early April, thin and haggard. He had burned every piece of furniture, every tool handle, every scrap of wood in his cabin to maintain marginal warmth through February and March. He had subsisted on minimal food, rationing supplies stretched far beyond intended duration. He looked 20 years older than when Lachlan had last seen him. Thorne stood in the entrance of the underground chamber and said nothing for a long time. He looked at the stone fireplace with its minimal ash accumulation. He looked at the remaining firewood stacked along the wall, still substantial despite winter consumption. He looked at Lachlan, who appeared healthy and well-fed. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Thorne asked how much wood Lachlan had burned. 1.5 cords, Lachlan replied. Thorne had burned 8 cords and still nearly froze. The efficiency difference was catastrophic. Thorne asked about interior temperature. 65 to 70 degrees with small fires twice daily, Lachlan explained. Thorne's cabin had never exceeded 40 degrees despite fires burning day and night. Other survivors began appearing. Ewan Drummond returned to assess his property and heard about Lachlan's success. He visited and examined the chamber construction carefully. He asked technical questions about excavation depth, roof thickness, ventilation design. He took notes. He acknowledged he had been wrong to mock the approach. Declan Murtaugh came back in May to salvage tools from his abandoned cabin. He detoured to see the underground shelter everyone was discussing. He stood inside the chamber, feeling the cool, stable temperature even in spring warmth, and understood immediately what Lachlan had accomplished. Murtaugh asked if Lachlan would help him build a similar structure. Lachlan agreed. The validation wasn't triumphant or celebrated, it was quiet and practical. Men who had dismissed the idea as insane now recognized it as the only rational solution. The winter had taught brutal lessons. Traditional methods failed. Underground construction succeeded. The physics were undeniable. The results spoke clearly. Lachlan spent late spring and summer helping 3 other men excavate and build underground chambers. Each structure followed the same basic principles: horizontal excavation into stable hillside, stone-reinforced entrance, thick earth roof, minimal heating requirements. Variations emerged based on individual sites and preferences, but the core concept remained consistent. By autumn 1843, 4 underground shelters existed in the basin. The following winter was equally harsh. All 4 structures performed exactly as designed. Occupants remained comfortable. Firewood consumption stayed minimal. No one fled. No one suffered frostbite. No one died. Word traveled through the scattered hunting and trapping community during 1844 and 1845. Stories reached trading posts and settlements about Lachlan Doyle's underground shelter and the brutal winter it had survived with minimal fuel. Men who had abandoned the high basin territories began returning, but not to rebuild traditional cabins. They came to excavate. The technique acquired a name through informal consensus: Doyle's method, sometimes shortened to Doyle style or simply underground construction. Lachlan never promoted the name or claimed ownership of the idea. He simply shared information freely with anyone who asked. The practical advantages were self-evident. No salesmanship was required. Variations emerged as different builders adapted the core principles to specific circumstances. Some excavations were shallower, only 8 feet deep instead of 12, sacrificing some insulation for reduced labor. Others were larger, accommodating multiple occupants or families. A few incorporated stone reinforcement walls instead of relying solely on soil stability. One notable variation came from a Norwegian trapper named Torsten Halvorsen, who arrived in 1845. Halvorsen had experience with Scandinavian turf houses and contributed refinements to roof construction. He introduced a technique of layering birch bark with pine boughs before adding soil, creating improved waterproofing and additional insulation. His modification was quickly adopted by others. The common element across all variations was earth insulation and thermal mass principle. Regardless of specific construction details, every structure was excavated into hillsides rather than built on the surface. Every structure relied on stable subsurface temperature as baseline warmth. Every structure required minimal heating compared to traditional cabins. By 1846, an estimated 20 underground shelters existed across the Wyoming and Montana territories. The concentration was highest in areas with severe winter conditions where traditional cabins had failed catastrophically. In milder regions, surface construction remained adequate, and the labor-intensive excavation work wasn't justified. The shelters proved durable beyond initial expectations. Lachlan's original chamber remained in excellent condition after 4 winters. The roof showed no signs of settling or water damage. The walls maintained stability. The stone entrance weathered storms without degradation. The structure required essentially no maintenance, unlike wooden cabins which demanded constant chinking repair, roof patching, and structural reinforcement. Documentation of lives saved was imprecise, but testimonials accumulated. Men who had nearly died in cabins during previous winters survived comfortably in underground shelters. Families who had abandoned the territories due to impossible heating demands returned and thrived. The mortality rate from cold exposure dropped measurably in areas where underground construction was adopted. The spread wasn't dramatic or revolutionary in appearance. No formal announcements, no organized movement, simply practical men recognizing superior survival strategy and implementing it. The idea propagated through demonstration and results. Each successful winter in an underground shelter convinced more people that conventional wisdom about frontier housing was dangerously flawed. By 1848, Doyle's method was established knowledge among mountain hunters and trappers operating in extreme cold regions. The technique had transitioned from experimental innovation to proven standard practice. Lachlan Doyle left the basin in autumn of 1850. The fur trade had collapsed completely. Hunting remained viable, but increasingly competitive as more settlers moved west. He was approaching 40 years old and feeling the accumulated wear of hard winters and harder labor. The underground chamber had served him well for 8 years, but it was time to move on. He sold his trapping territory and modest equipment to a younger hunter from Pennsylvania. The sale included the underground shelter, which by then had acquired almost legendary status among men who understood mountain survival. The buyer recognized the chamber's value exceeded everything else in the transaction. Lachlan traveled to Oregon Territory and established a small ranch in the Willamette Valley. The climate was mild, winters were wet but rarely severe. He had no need for underground construction there. He built a conventional cabin, adequate for the temperate conditions, and settled into a quieter existence. He married in 1852, started a family, raised cattle and sheep, became a respected but unremarkable member of his community. Few people in Oregon knew about his previous life or his innovation. It wasn't something he discussed. The underground shelter belonged to a different time and place. Back in the Wyoming and Montana mountains, the shelters remained. Lachlan's original chamber was continuously occupied through the 1850s and 60s by successive inhabitants. The structure required minimal maintenance, occasional roof patching, periodic door repair. Otherwise, it simply persisted, functional and protective year after year. Other underground shelters followed similar patterns. Some were eventually abandoned as the territories changed and populations shifted. Others remained in use for decades. A few were occupied into the 1870s and 80s, long after their original builders had moved on or died. The technique itself became embedded in regional knowledge, men teaching sons, trappers sharing information with younger partners. The specific attribution to Lachlan Doyle faded over time, but the core concept persisted. When extreme cold threatened, smart men dug into hillsides rather than building on top of them. Modern historical documentation is incomplete. No formal records tracked how many underground shelters were built or how many lives the technique saved. But fragmentary evidence suggests the impact was substantial. Journals from the period reference Doyle-style construction. Trading post records mention underground shelters as established practice. Survival rates in extreme cold regions improved measurably during the years following the innovation's introduction. Lachlan Doyle died in 1873 at age 62 on his Oregon ranch. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone made no mention of mountains, underground chambers, or survival innovation. To his family, he was simply a rancher who had lived a good, quiet life. But in the mountains, the legacy remained carved into hillsides. Chambers excavated with back-breaking labor, stone entrances weathered by decades of storms, sod roofs still holding back winter cold, silent proof that sometimes the best solution to impossible problems is thinking completely differently about the problem itself.